Alright guys, so in today's video we will be talking about building a microservice using Java, because in YouTube I have seen a lot of people struggling to understand end-to-end picture of building microservices using Java or using Spring Boot. However, I've seen that there are many videos you will find on YouTube building a microservice using Spring Boot and Java, but none of the video, at least what I have seen, is basically telling a candidate who is very new enough for Spring Boot or Java, if he wants to understand the entire picture, right? Creating the APIs, connecting to the database, talking to the database, getting data from the database, and deploying that application to the Kubernetes as Docker container by using a Docker file. Right, and also using the data migration to building the schema and the tables and everything, building an enterprise level microservices. I have seen none of the videos telling anyone to, that's how one can create an application end to end. But in this particular video, we will cover all these aspects of a microservices, building microservices using Spring Boot, JDK, and database migration. And then your packaging it using Helm and shipping it to the Kubernetes cluster and accessing from there, right? For all these steps, we will step by step try deploying each steps, creating a database in Kubernetes, and then setting up the application, writing all the code, and then we will conclude it. All right, so let's begin. So this microservices that we will start with will have JDK 17. Also, we will have database migration using Flyway. So this video will help you to understand the entire picture. Also, this video will help you to crack interviews, because you will get an end-to-end understanding. So, and also creating APIs, right? And then using Helm to package, then Docker image creation, and then deploying service to Kubernetes. All right, and prerequisite, we should have a database, right? So requirement, we should have a database. Let's select Postgres, because that's the common database, traditional transactional database that we could use for simplicity, and then we can create more videos if you want, Cassandra, MongoDB, etc., right? So for simplicity, we will have a database, Postgres running into Kubernetes. All right, so first let's talk about the architecture diagram, then come and then try implementing it. All right, so let's say you have your Kubernetes cluster here. So there are two ways of running a database, right? First of all, let's understand the database. One, if you have this Azure cloud, right, and then inside Azure cloud you have your Kubernetes cluster, let's say running here. All right, so we will have one ingress pod. I'll also come to the ingress pod. Oh yes, I'll add one point, exposing APIs via ingress within Kubernetes. All right, then in the next series we will try creating another microservices which is talking to another services. We'll try optimizing it using performance and all these things, right, using Java 8 completable feature. So you will have an ingress pod. So you will have a pod, I'll say pod, right? This will be your ingress pod, and this will be your another pod. So this will be your user service pod. Okay, that's what we will create. So this will be your user service pod. Okay, and this will be your ingress. So ingress we will use as Nginx. All right, and then user service we have in Java. Okay, and then one way of doing this is you have a Postgres database running inside a pod as a container itself. All right, so this is one way. So in most of the organization, the way it works is Postgres DB as container. So in most of the organization, I have seen for lower environments, they don't provision a database in cloud environment. But however, that's not the correct way. Many people does, but it's very difficult from the maintenance perspective and from the scaling perspective. Because let's say if this is the scenario you are using in production, right, then you will have to do a lot of maintenance for these containers. Also, you will have to manually ensure that high availability is present for these container, replication is present, etc., etc. All these aspects of distributed system should be aligning while you're running a Postgres as a container. So that's not the correct way of doing so. So I'll say non-production way. All right. And then this is your Azure Kubernetes. I'll say Azure subscription. So this is, let's say, your Azure subscription. This is your cloud environment. Okay, so I'll color it with your cloud environment, and then this guy is your Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so I'll say Kubernetes cluster. I'll say this is Azure Kubernetes, to be more specific. I'll say Azure Kubernetes. Okay. So this is the non-production way. So from ingress, the call will go to user service, and user service will call simply to your Postgres, which is running as database container. Here you will have a user. All right, you will have a user here. Oh, sorry. And you will have this user here, which will be calling this ingress. Okay, so this is a way. However, it's a non-production way. Okay, it's not the production way of doing things correctly. So what I'll do is I'll increase it a bit, and I'll say 15. Okay, so let's discuss what will be the production way, right? So the correct production way of doing so is, and this is for only development environment. I'll say only for development environment mostly. Okay, and then let's copy and then understand the another aspect of it. Okay, so I'll paste it here. I'll actually paste it here. Okay, so this will be a production way. So the correct production way will be you're not running Postgres as container. Instead, you have a Postgres instance created in Azure. So you're using the Postgres instance as part of the Azure. All right, so this will be your Azure, and then this will be out of your Kubernetes cluster. Okay, and then this guy will be talking to this guy. Okay, directly. So we don't manage, we don't manage Postgres database inside Kubernetes. Here, if you see, our Postgres database is running as a managed service inside your Azure subscription, or let's say any cloud that you have, right? So this is the correct production way of doing things. So we will try implementing this one, okay? Because in my other scenarios, in my other video series, I have implemented this kind of architecture where our Postgres running inside the Azure cloud, not in the Kubernetes cluster. Okay. So now let's go. So and another part is I'm using my Docker desktop. Inside Docker desktop, I already have my Docker desktop Kubernetes cluster, which is running in local, and then we will deploy our services in this Kubernetes cluster. All right, guys. So let's create the user table. I'll say user table.sql. All right. So now create table user db dot let's say user record, and then I will create user id as varchar. All right, so I'll say 200, and then I'll say not null. Okay, and then I'll say var name varchar, and then I'll say 50, say not null. I'll say age, I'll say integer, and then I'll say not null. Okay, I'll say gender, and then gender will be 1 character only, and I'll say check the valid values for gender would be gender in, there will be 2 values, right? What are 2 values? One will be M, one will be F. All right, so now I'll say third thing, I'll say created time, just to keep track at what time it has been created, and I'll say not null, and I'll say updated time, I'll say not null. All right, now here let me create one constraint. I'll have to make the user ID as the primary key. So I'll say user ID, I'll say pk. Okay, I'll make it as primary key. And what is my primary key? User ID, user ID. All right, that's it. So that's how I will create a user table. All right, so now I will rerun my application. Okay, let's see the exception. Syntax error at okay, comma. All right, I'll rerun it. All right, so you see my user application has been started and it has migrated, successfully validated 2 migrations. Migrated this user table schema, this. I'll go and check. Okay, so I have user record now. All right, this user record table. Now I have all these columns. You see, all these columns. All right. So now what I'll do, I'll stop this, and let's create a controller. All right. So I'll say controller, and then I'll say user controller. All right, so I will say my REST, this will be my REST controller. So I'll say REST controller. Okay, now my APIs, I want my APIs to start with as version 1 APIs. So these are my version 1 APIs. So now I will say REST controller, my version 1, and I will also use. So this is same as required constructor. I don't have to create it manually. And then I will say public. I will now let's create the controller methods later. First create the service class. I'll create a service package. Service. All right. So now I'll create the service later. In fact, first create the JPA repositories. All right. So I'll create user repository. Okay, now actually that has to be an interface, not a class. Okay, now what I will be using as my entity in order to do the ORM operations with my database. So I'll say entities. Okay, I'll create one entity. I'll say user. All right, so I'll now create my entity first. So now this will act as my user object to talk with the database in terms. So this is my object, and that will get mapped to the user table in terms of my code. All right, so I'll say entity, and you use data. Data means it will manually invoke. It will automatically create all these things: getter, setter, require constructor, toString method, equals, and hashcode method. All right. So I'll go back, and then I'll say my table name will be user record. Okay, and my schema is user DB. Okay, and I'll say use smaller case user record. Okay, now I'll create an ID. That's the error it's showing. Now I'll close this. I'll say private string ID. Okay, now I want this field to get mapped with user ID field. All right, and then I have to make this a particular attribute as act as an ID. So I'll say ID is the ID. That's how my JP understand. Okay, this is the ID field, and the value of this ID I want a UUID. So I'll say generated value. What kind of value I want? The generator I want is my UUID. All right. And then which generator in particular I want? I want my generic generator. I will use a class, right? So which class? There is a class UUID name. I'll say UUID, which is strategy. What does it take? Name and this strategy. All right. Okay. All right. So strategy I will use to generate the UUID. So I'll say org hibernate UUID generator. Right, so I'll go back, generated value. Okay, I think this is enough. I don't have to use. Okay, I'll say prior to hibernate 365 class. Okay, I think this is enough. If it doesn't work, because it says have before hibernate 62. Now I will use I will map another fields. Okay, I'll say private, and then I'll say string name because I had the name right. So I'll say which column name it will map to. It is. I don't have to actually use column names because it will automatically be mapped. Int age, and then this I will map string gender. All right, so now let's say I want then this is gender, and then I'll say private, and then let's say I have to map, I'll say local date time created time, and then I had the updated time. It's the updated time. All right, so this was the column name. What was the column name? Was created time. All right, here I'll say my name is updated time. Okay, now let's try doing another exercise as well. Let's use, because it's very easy use case, let's use a little complicated one. So what I'll do, let's use a kind of mapping in the GPA. Okay, what kind of mapping? One to many. So let's say one user, let's say this is an invoice application. Okay, one user can contain multiple invoices. All right, so what I'll do is I have to create how user is associated with my invoices. One user can contain multiple invoices, and multiple invoices will belong to one single user. So that's one to many mapping. All right, so let's create another invoice table and map my user object to multiple invoices, right? And see in database how will that be. All right, so let's create your another invoice, and then we will see. So let's say I'll copy this name, otherwise I'll have to rewrite this thing. So I'll say I'll create another file and I will use 3. I'll say create invoice table. Okay, now in my invoice table I will create table my user db dot, it is user db, my schema name is user db, right? What is my schema name? User underscore db, all right. So I'll say user under, I'll go back, user underscore db and dot, I will say invoice. Okay, now I'll say let's not make this table longer, I'll just keep everything short. So I'll say invoice id and then this id will be varchar, let's say it's 200 and then I'll mark it as not null. Okay, and then I'll say my user id, the user id it will be mapped to, will be varchar. Okay, and then this will be not. Now I'll say an invoice number and then make it this number, let's say a varchar value, and then let's say length will be 100 and then this is not null. And then I'll create the created time and the, I'll copy this and then I'll go back and copy this. Okay, however I don't have to use, this will be my invoice ID and then this will be my invoice ID. Okay, sorry. Now remember the fact that this user ID that we have inside invoice table, it belongs to a user table, so that's kind of a foreign key inside this table, fundamental concepts of a database. Alright, so what I'll do is I'll create another constant of user ID and this user ID is a foreign key. Alright, which field? This user ID. So this reference, the reference of this user ID is in my schema dot my user record. Alright, so I'll say user ID. Okay, so that's how I have created my invoice table. Now I have to create an entity for my invoice as well, right? The same way we created an entity for user. So I'll go back and then I'll create an entity invoice. Okay, then I'll go back and copy all these annotations. I don't have to write it again. Okay, and then I'll say invoice. Alright, this is my schema. And then I'll go back and then I'll copy all these things and then I'll paste it right here. Okay, and now I will copy other fields as well. I'll go, because my created and these things are same, so I'll say invoice. Okay, now remember the fact that from my invoice table I have to map the user. So which field of user? User ID particularly, and user should contain multiple invoices. So how can I map that? Using Hibernate mapping. You have to be good at Hibernate mapping. So there are multiple mappings, many to one, one to many, many to many, right? This particular use case is around one to many mapping. So how can I map it? The way I map it is I'll have to add another list of invoice, because my one user will belong to multiple invoices. So I'll have to say invoice, I'll say numbers, I'll say just say invoice number, right? Now, and then this is my one to many mapping, and this is mapped to my user. So I'll tell you which user it is. This has to be the same reference that you have created in the invoice table. I'll come to that point. First I'm creating this, then I'll say, then I'll say I'll go back here and then I will create my many-to-one, because here I have, right? So I'll say user, and then this is my user. All right. So this is my many-to-one, because from invoice perspective it is many-to-one, and I will simply say join column. Now what is my join column? I'm joining based on my user ID. All right. Now this user needs to be referenced to where? Here, right? So it has been resolved. All right. So now in the user table, I have to go back and say column as well. So I'll say column, but do I have any column here? I do not have any column, right? So but that's not the owning side of, I will say name is equal to invoice numbers. All right. So now I have my user entity created, and then I have my invoice entity created. All right. And then I have my invoice user, right? And then this is invoice, and then I have my user. So it will be mapped to invoice number. So it will be in my invoice number. Do I have an invoice number? I do have an invoice number, because here, okay, this invoice number I left to create it. So after my user ID, I will say private string invoice number, and then this column would be, name column would be invoice number. All right. And what is the column name I have created? Invoice number. All right. Okay. And then this is my invoice number, and then in my user I have my invoice numbers. Okay. All right. Now I have invoice, and then I have this, and I have this. Am I leaving something? All right. Sure. Let me create a user repository properly. So this I have to extend the JPA repository. All right. So what is my entity? User entity, or what kind of my ID is? This is my ID. So I'll import it. So I'll import class and this. All right. I'll create another entity, which is my invoice. So invoice repository, and then I'll say extends JPA repository, and this is invoice and this is string. All right. And remember that it's an interface, not a class. All right. Okay. I have to import this. All right. Now I can rerun this application. Okay, invoice table failed. Okay, so the problem with my invoice table is I left comma again. I'll rerun this. All right, we have an issue again. User ID is duplicated by entity when mapping multiple people to the same column. I see. So this is originating in the entity invoice. I'll go to invoice. Oh, okay. sorry, I'll say, what is my copy paste mistake? Invoice ID. So I'll go back to invoice, I'll say invoice ID. Okay, now this is okay. Alright, so my application has been started. Alright, so I'll go back to my dbeaver, and then inside the dbeaver I will check. I have my, I'll refresh. Okay, so I have invoice as well. Alright, in the foreign key I have this user DB. So all my tables and everything has been created here. Alright, so now let's create the service class. Alright, now and then use it, because the service class will be called inside controller. That's how we will expose all the APIs. Okay, so now what I'll do is I'll go to my user, I'll go to my service class, and then I will create my user service, and then I will use at the service center, I will also use SLF4J, and then I'll also use required R. Okay, now I have to use private user repository. Alright, or maybe I would have to use invoice repository as well, so I'll import these. Okay, now what I'll try to get is let's first create a get method. Okay, so now remember, the way it will work is I will not directly expose my entities to the controller, right? The correct way of doing so is, I'll go to notes. The correct way of doing so is you always expose your data transfer objects. All right, so and then you convert it to entities, which belongs to database, right? And then this belongs to outer layer of your service. Now reason behind, so let's say your application is a microservice and it's serving multiple clients, right? So now let's say there is an API, and then in your entity, let's say you have 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 field and 6 field. Now for let's say V1 XYZ API, you don't want to expose all 6 field, you only want to expose 1, 2 and 3 field, and then your V1 XYZ XYK API, you only want to have 1, 2, 3 and then 4 and 5, right? So that's the way you can control your exposing the data using data transfer object. So that's the correct way. You always expose your data transfer object and you map it, when you doing all the operation, you have to map it back to your entities and entities to data transfer object. So that's the conversion here and there you will have to do throughout this project. All right, so now what I'll do is first I'll create a get API, right? I'll not create the create API. And then using the get API because if I do that, this project will become this whole video will become a little longer. So we will keep the thing simple and create a get user API. All right, but this get user API is kind of it returns a list and takes a list of IDs. Based upon IDs, it try to find out all the IDs and the records from the database. All right, so what I'll do is list of. Okay, I'll have to create remember the DTO. So what I'll do is I'll go here and then I'll say DTO, and then I will say user GTO. All right, now in my user GTO, because you see for my internal database ORM operations, I am managing 2 different entities, user and invoice. However, when I'm returning back, I'm not returning 2 entities. I have to return one single object. right? Because I have to aggregate the data and send it back to the consumer. So I will aggregate everything into one single object. How can I do that? I'll simply create string ID. So let's say this is my user ID, and then I'll say, I'll say my user ID user ID. I'll say name, and then I will say age, right? And then I'll say private. I had the gender. I'll say gender, and then I have to return all the invoice numbers, right? So I'll say invoice numbers. Let me import this field. All right, now I will also return a local date time for created time. All right, and I will also return my local date time for my updated time. All right, now this is the data I want my consumers to get whenever they call my API, get API. I'll go back, and then I will try creating a basic method for get operation. So I'll say you return. What do you return? You return user DT. You don't have to return the entities. That's the concept we are using, right? So I'll say import class, and I'll say get users. Now how will you get the users? Based on what identifiers you will get the user from database. So I will take list of IDs. All right. Okay. Now here I will say, because I am using SLF4j my logging, so I'll say looking into database for IDs. What all IDs? I'll say these IDs. Okay. Now here I have to call my user repository. All right. So I'll say user repository, and then find all by ID. Okay. And then I'll say IDs. Okay. Now I have to catch the data. So what will this return? This will return my list of user entities. All right, users. All right, so I have the list of users here. Now what I do for each, because as part of this I will also get the invoice ID, right? Invoice number actually. Now using that ID I have to get the records from invoice repository as well, because you see I will only get the user ID. I have the user ID here, right? And for that all records, for example, if you pass me ID1 and ID2, so for ID1 and 2 I get 2 users from the database. Now for this user ID1, the record 1, I have to get all the invoices from the database, right? So what I'll do is I have to get all the record from the database using my invoice repository, right? So what I can do is users stream dot for each, I will for each user record, right, I will try to invoke my invoice repository and find all by ID. Okay, there is no user ID, right? So I have to go back and create a method, because I only have find all by ID, find all by. We don't have anything like find all by user ID, right? So I have to go here, and then I have to create one method, right? So what will I create? I'll create get invoices, right, and find all by, what is the field name? If I go to my invoice record, so this is my user, this is user ID, so I'll have to say this is my user ID, right? So I have to say find all by user ID, and then I'll say ID. Alright, so JPA will automatically create a method implementation for this, and then I'll call user ID. Okay, and then I will pass my user dot get ID here. Okay, now once I call that, right, I will get some user invoices right here. Now I will get list of invoices. All right, so I'll say this here. I will import this. Okay, so I'll attach user dot invoice numbers to invoices. Okay, all right, so now I have to return my user, right? So I have to convert my user entities to my user object, which is user DTO. So in order to do so, I'll have to create a method. So what I'll do is I'll create a method, let's say, and you can use mappers in real time. Developers use mappers, right? Just to make things easier, what I'm creating is I'm creating it manually. So I'll say populate user DTO. All right, and what I will pass here, I will pass a user entity here. All right, so I'll say user DTO, user DTO is equal to new user DTO, and then I will say user DTO dot set ID. So what is my ID? User dot get ID, and then I'll say user DTO dot name, user dot get name. I'll say user DTO dot get age. Oh, sorry. User DTO dot set age. I'll have to use user dot create age. All right, and then I'll say user DTO dot set gender. So the gender will also come from my gender. Okay, and then I'll say if my user dot invoice numbers, if this size is greater than 0, that means there are some invoice number, it's not empty, right? Then what I'll do, I'll say user dot stream, user dot get invoices, right? I'll say stream, and then I'll map my invoice. I'll have an invoice, right? I only want to show the invoice number, I don't want to show the, so I'll say get invoice number, and then I'll collect a list. All right, so I have my invoice numbers here, and then I'll store it inside a list of you will have what, a string of numbers. I'll say invoice numbers, and then I will simply map in the user DTO, I'll map my list of invoice numbers. All right, now invoice, oh sorry, yeah. Okay, invoice numbers, and if it's not exist, you simply just add in the invoice number, you simply add collectors dot or collections dot empty list. All right, and then you simply return the user DTO. Okay, so now what I'll do here is I will, for all the users that I have, for users I will map, and I will call user DTO. Okay, and then I'll map the user DTO and I'll send a collect this information. Okay, all right guys, so and then I'll create a controller for this. So I'll go back and I'll say, oh, I already created one, right? So I'll go back here and then I'll say your private final user service, and then I'll say user service. Alright, so now I will simply call you return public list of string whenever I call get users, and then okay. Now I want to receive the IDs as square parameter, right? That's what I want. So what I'll do is I will take it as request param, and the params, the name of parameter is ID. So I'll say a string IDs. All right. Now and then I'll say, okay, I don't have the SLF4J here. I'll go and I'll say SLF4J log dot info. I'll say inside get user API, and then I will invoke users dot get users and I'll pass the IDs. Alright, oh sorry, I'll return it. Okay, not a string, it's a user GTO. Okay, and I have to give a path as well. So I'll say get mapping, I'll say user. Alright, or let's say users. Alright, so now my one API is completed here. Now, but my tables are empty. One way is to I create my object, but rather what I'll do is I'll use a simple approach, sorry, and then I will insert some data, dummy data manually. Alright, so I'll go and say for insert data invoice and user. Alright, so let's say invoice, we'll say invoice dummy data. Okay, now here I have to insert some dummy data, so I'll put in some of the dummy data and then I'll come back. Alright guys, so I have put in some of the dummy data right in the invoice table and in the user record table. Alright, and then we will run this application and we will try doing one exercise. Okay. Alright, so my application has been started. I'll go here and then inside my user table I'll refresh and then I will say if there is some data. Okay, so I have my dummy data here. Alright, and then I'll go to my user record and I'll say okay, I have some user record in the user ID as well, but remember I have used the same foreign keys. So if this is the ID, user ID right here, I have used the same user ID into the invoice table. Okay, just to make sure that the constraint of foreign key properly followed. Alright, so now we will try calling this API. I'll say get and then I'll say HTTP. So by default port is 8080. So I'll say localhost 80 v1 users. I need to pass the IDs of user. Alright, So I will, let's say simply I will get this ID and then I will use it here and then I'll hit. Alright, some issue. This I see repositories. Okay, that is because we have not injected it. So when you use private final, Spring Boot automatically injects that bean into this bean of user repository into bean of user service. That's the basic fundamental of the Spring. Let's run it again. Alright, and then you call the API. Oh, again error. Okay. Let's look at the error. User db.user record doesn't exist. I see. Is it calling? User. Oh, okay. See. Let me debug it again. Alright, so my application is up again. I will hit this API again. Okay, so I'm getting all the records. However, I'm not getting the create and update time, and invoice number is nothing. Okay, so what I'll do is I will map the invoice number and created number as well. Right, so yeah, here I'll say user DTO dot set. I'll say user dot get create time. So this is users created time, right? Not the invoice. Set updated time user dot get updated time. All right. So this is what I did, and then what I'll say, I'll go to console and say looking IDs. Okay, and then I'll run it again. So let's debug it. So you will also get an idea. Okay. I'll go and put a debug inside here. One debug here and one debug here. Alright. So let this application get up. Okay, so I will move forward. Okay, I will have this ID. I'll move forward. Right, so in the user, and then I will go here, and then I will go here. Alright, if I move it forward. Alright, so but I'm not getting any invoices because maybe for this user there is no invoice exist, right? So now that's enough of Spring Boot, I believe so, because we already connected with our database, right? As part of this exercise, we already have created these things, right? So this is done, and so I'll say this is done, and this is also done. Creating APIs, this is also done, right? So now let's try to focus on the other aspects of deployment, right? So development part we have done so far. Video has already gone longer so much. So now we already have an API in place, so let's try to make its Docker file, because now I want to create a Docker file, right? Because if you remember our architecture, there is one architecture I've shown you. I'll go back. and then I will go back to my diagram. You see, I have to create a Docker file. That's only I can. Then I have to create a help chart. Then only I can deploy this application using help chart to my Kubernetes cluster. My Kubernetes cluster already running in my Docker desktop here. Alright, so now let's create the Docker file. So what I'll say, I'll stop this. I'll stop this and I'll go back here. Not the Java class. I'll say Docker file. Okay, now I want to use, I already know this. I'll say from open JDK image, right? This is the one, JDK. I remember it now because I use it very often. You guys have to go and check in the Docker Hub what is the actual name, right? In case you want to use some other JDK. I'll say copy. And what I'm saying is, you see this build? Inside you build, if you see, I have inside my build generated library. So what I'll say, I will run, let me skip this first, and then I will go to my build section, and then I just disabled my test. I didn't want to anything get hampered to my Gradle build. So I'm creating my Gradle build. Alright, so my guild, if you see, my build has been created, right? Build successful. Gradle build is completed. So what I'll do is, if you see, this library folder has been created, and inside library I have this user service jar, and I also have this user service plain jar. So I will probably use this jar. So what I want to ask my Docker image, right? When you create a container, what you should do is you should copy all the files inside build and directory to my Docker container, right? As app.jar. So you need to copy this jar as app.jar inside my Docker container. Alright, so I have to give that path because I'm currently inside my user service, at my user service, so I'll have to give the path build, and then inside build, whatever exists, you copy it as app.jar, right? And then I have to define an entry point that the moment you run the Docker image, the Docker container should run this command. Which command? So my command would be java hyphen, not here, I have to give the second argument, hyphen jar, and with jar I have to go third on my app.jar. Alright, that's it. It's very plain and simple Docker. However, that's not the correct and the professional Docker file, but for this project, it will do what we want to achieve. We can achieve using this, right? So that's enough. Now I have the Docker file, right? Now what I could do, I have to create its container, its image now. Okay. So what I'll do, I'll open a terminal, and then I already have the Gradle build. So I'll say Docker build. Right now I want to give the image name. What would be my image name? So let's say -t. My name will be user service, and then let's say retail, or let's say anything, right? And the tag I want to get 1.0 and then I'll say dot. Alright, so it will start creating my Docker image out of this project. So this is all manual, but see, whatever we are doing, this is only for local development. If you want to see the everything, because in professional world, you don't have to do it manually and deploy to your Kubernetes cluster, right? Because there in your environment in your organization, you follow a CI/CD pipeline. So everything that we are doing is manually here will be keep under the CI/CD as part of the CI/CD, and CI/CD will take care of all these steps, right? So if I go back and see Docker images, if I say user service So I have my Docker image here, right? So this is my Docker image. Now I want to create Helm charts, right? That's how I can. So I have this Docker file now. I have this Docker image now, right? So now I have to use my Helm charts, and then only I can use this Docker image to deploy as container right here. All right. So I'll go back, and then I will say I'll create a folder Helm. Where is the directory? I'll say Helm. All right. So now inside Helm, I'll say Helm. Now I will say Helm create user service. So now it will create inside Helm. It will create Helm charts automatically. So that's a Helm command. You need to install the Helm command, Helm in your local computer first before doing these Helm operations. All right. So Helm command works like this. If we'll say Helm list, so see this, right? So because if you see Helm list, this is directly pointing to my Kubernetes cluster. So I ran this Helm list. So it's showing that in your Kubernetes cluster you have deployed Postgres using your Helm deployment. So now I will go back in my templates. I already see this. I already have these things by default. These things here. All right, HPA, ingress, etc., all these things. All right. So now, even before this, now in order to fulfill this point of our ingress, to expose it to ingress, right here, this part, and because this part I have to do, because this is our ingress. Now I have to deploy one ingress first. So I'll say Helm ingress. And then okay, I don't have Nginx. Isn't there any bitnami? Chart. All right, so this is my ingress. So I can simply go and what was the other? Nginx ingress. So we are using Nginx, right, as ingress. And what is this? Okay, Nginx ingress, right? And Qt apply. Okay, I'll use this one, right? But I will have to change few things. What I'll do is I will put it down, close all the files, and then I'll go to my notes. Yeah. I will not create this namespace, okay, and then I'll say ingress Nginx. Yes, I'll go back here, I'll create a new tab, and then I'll run this command. So it will install an ingress into my Kubernetes cluster. All right. Now I will go back and update my Helm charts accordingly. Okay, so how can I update? You have to go and update the, first of all, let me see in the deployment.yml where it is pointing to 8080. So my application is running at 8080. I have to do 8080. Okay, now I have to update my values.yml, right? So in my values.yml, I don't have to use this cluster IP because that's not the correct one. So I'm using this retail, and I'm using user service because so it will directly point to my local, right? And my tag is 1.0, correct? And then I'll say cluster be 8080, and then I will come down a little, and then I'll say my Kubernetes ingress, I will enable it, and my class name is nginx. Alright, now Kubernetes.tls, I don't want this, so I'll say false. I'll remove this. I'll remove this part as well. Now my host is my local host, right? And then this part I'll say after path user service, whatever comes. Now what could come? Everything that is, let's say there could be an API, so that will start with / right? Or these things, right? This, and then I'll say anything dot, then after that anything that comes up, right? So the way it will work is ingress URL and then the user hyphen service. So because in my ingress there could be multiple services, I'm rerouting it to user services. Maybe tomorrow I'll have some XYZ service, maybe tomorrow I'll have PQR service. So I'm currently pointing from my ingress load balancer to my user service. Alright, but in order to do so, to pass this parameter, I have to write the another annotation for this. And if you go back, you will see, you probably will find it out. So if they have, if they have, I don't know if they have or not, but anyways, what I'll do now is nginx, okay, I will say nginx ingress, let me search it first, nginx.ingress, it is nginx.ingress, yes, yeah, this is the one, dot rewrite, yeah, this is what we want, right? So now I'll go back and copy this, oh sorry, I'll go back and copy and I'll paste it here. So I'll remove this and I'll paste it here. Okay, ingress dot and then dot Kubernetes dot io dot rewrite. Alright, so this is my second parameter, so it will come after this and also this. Alright, so whatever comes as a second parameter will be passed right here. Alright, and then the part type should be prefix because I'm using prefix. Alright, and rest you can keep same as it is, right? So this is user service prefix, this false, and then cluster IP 8080, and then you have to point a retail user service. Alright, now you see the way it currently works is I have passed a username and password to my application.yml, but that's not the correct way because your username and password for your data source will vary as per your environment to environment, right? So I have to pass it via Helm because what I'll do, I'll create a production level values different, and then I'll also create a different for your development environment, and I will create a different one for my QA environment, integration, and so on and so forth. So I have to pass my custom define variables, right? So how can I? So I'll in my helpers.tpl, I will use this file to define my custom variables. All right. So in Helm, the way you could do is you can define it, right? You can define, and then you can define my user.service. Let's say you have user.service. Let's say user.service. I'll say env.vars, and then I'll say this. Okay, and here it will end. This is the way you define anything, right? Now I want to override. I want to override which field? Spring, data source and URL, right? This is why I want to override. So I'll say spring data source URL, right? And then my value will be value. I'm saying that okay, you take this value, or also because these values should not be open, right, for everyone. So what I'll do is I can create one secret. That's another way of creating it. You can create a secret and put everything inside it, and then you can refer that secret, right? That's one way, or that's the correct way. Or you can just directly override the values right here. That's the another way, right? So we already, if you remember, we already have one secret here, right? Because this guy created for us. If you see, if you open secrets, you will see this guy already created secret for us. So this has already has password, Postgres password. Alright, so what I'll do, I'll directly refer to this, and I'll override username and password property here. So I'll go back and pass it here. Alright, and then I'll override. I will override the username now. So username and URL is something that you can expose to public. That's not something very secret, but it's a good practice to keep the password in a secret, right? So now I will use this value as Postgres, right? And then I'll pass the Spring data source. I will say password, and then this value I have to point to my different secret in the Kubernetes cluster, right? But before that, I don't want to take this value from I don't want to write this value directly here. I want to keep these values in my values.yml. So what I'll do, I'll say my db dot URL, and I'll also say db dot username. All right, I'll go back and then copy this, and then I'll put it in the I'll put it here, and then I'll go back, I'll use this, and then I'll put it here. All right, now I want to get this value from here to here. So how can I get this value? Using this. So if I go back and helper.txt, I'll use this. So I'll say values, inside values file, go to inside db, go to inside URL, right, and just simply use it. And I'll say go to my values go my db and use my username. All right, and then this guy, and now I have to get my password from which secret? This secret, right? This secret value, this secret. So how can I do that? The way I can do that is I have to write value from, right, and then value from where I have to take this value from secret key ref, right, and then secret key ref, and what is the name of my secret? This is the name of my secret, right? And what is the key I want to use in order to get the password? So this is my key. So I'll simply use this Postgres password. I'll say Postgres password. All right. So see, everything is very generic. I'm not keeping any value or anything in the helpers.tpl. Now, the one thing is, it's currently it only exists in my helpers.tpl. I want to import these to my deployment.yml because that's where all the env and everything is being hosted. So I have to go and check where can I add the environment variables in my readiness after resources, right? I can add my env. Now I have to include these variables. I'll say include, and then I'll say user service dot env dot vars. All right, and then I'll have to use these intent and everything, so it will intent 12. All right, so that's how I'm importing all the environment variables from my helpers.tpl to my deployment.yml. All right, so now I have to run the helm install command, right, in order to deploy this into my Kubernetes cluster. All right, so let's go back to our terminal. So I'm already here, so I'll say helm install. I'll go back and check install command syntax. What was the command? Okay, helm install, and I'll say is the basic. I'll go. Okay, I'll say helm install helm user dot service. So user server. All right. So seems like it has deployed. All right, error. Right, so we'll see what is the error. Okay, so everything has been imported correctly, but there is a problem. Image also it has fetched. That's the readiness has failed. So I'll see why readiness has been failed. Oh, okay. So okay, it was not able to connect with the Postgres database. So what I'll do, yeah, I got it. So if you remember, right, and go to nodes, you see this was the URL we were using to, when we deployed the Postgres initially, it gave us this URL, right? So I'll go back to my values.yml and then I will use this URL. Okay, and then I'll go back again. Yeah, I'll run this command. Okay, so it's already in use. I have to, it's okay. I don't have to install it now. I have to rather upgrade it now because it's already there. So I'll say upgrade. Okay. So now if I go back, so I'll say it's in the running state. I'll try to tell the logs. Alright, so it's getting up now. Alright. So now this, if you see what Helm is doing, is it's basically use this Docker image, right, and then creating a container and deploying it to Kubernetes cluster. So in my cluster, my pod, my container is getting up. So if you look at the logs, you will realize, see. Alright, so it got up, but now seems like it got shut down. Alright, some issue. Now let's look at what is the issue. I describe for this. Alright, so my HTTP probe has been failed, right? Alright, maybe because I have to give the actuator URL in the deployment. So I'll say actuator. Okay, so now I will go back and not here, go back here, open the terminal, and then I'll Helm upgrade again. Upgrade. Okay, now I'll do get pods. So it has created a new pod. Alright, so now you see my container is getting up in a pod in Kubernetes. Alright, in fact my Tomcat has been started, right? So what I will do now is if you go back and say kubectl get svc. So this is my user service which is listening at 8080. Now in order to call these APIs, what I have to do, I have to call my user service. I have to port forward my user service, right? So now right. So now before this, my application is not up. If you go here and then run my postman, see, it will give you connection. Now what I'll do, I'll simply rerun this, and then if I hit this API, see, I've started getting data, right? So if you see handling connection, all right. So if I create another terminal here, and if I do get pods, and if I do kubectl logs have fun pods, you see looking for database this ID, right? And if I go here and then hit the API again and again, so let's say if I hit this again, you see inside this is some spelling mistake, get user API and then looking for the database. See, so that means our application is now ready and up and running, working properly inside my Kubernetes cluster. All right, so in this exercise, if you see, this we have done. So my service has become live now here, right? This is user service, right? So we created this user service with the get API inside it, connected with the Postgres database, and then we also created Docker file, and then we also created Helm charts for it. We overrided few of the environment variables according to the environment and deployed to the Kubernetes cluster, right? And then inside this Kubernetes cluster, we port forwarded it, and using port forward, we are now accessing the Postman APIs. All right.